I am genuinely bothered by more and more of the American press corps being captured by its own prejudices, beliefs, and bigotries. I actually think we as a free people do have to have a free press. I actually think it's very important, particularly at the local level, that we have reporters, journalists willing to ask tough questions of politicians of both sides of the aisle, investigating corruption, exposing it for the public. I think that's actually a very useful purpose of the media. I think it's a necessary purpose. A free people must have a free press who has the backs of the people. But increasingly, we don't have a free press. We have a press captured by its bigotries and prejudices inside a progressive bubble, willing to embrace left-wing talking points and right-wing stereotypes. And I'm genuinely bothered by that. I'll just start with the city of Atlanta. I have mentioned it several times lately. And I want to play you a clip. I actually pushed this clip out on Sunday to those of you on my email list. If you text DATA to 33777, you would have gotten it. You can subscribe, sign up for it. But this is a freelance journalist, David Peisner. He lives in Decatur, Georgia, Progressive Enclave. He's a left-wing freelance journalist, has been published in a number of left-leaning publications. And I want you to listen to what he says to CNN as riots broke out in the city of Atlanta. A supposedly peaceful protest became violent. Windows were smashed at the police foundation in downtown Atlanta. Police car was burned. People were arrested. But listen to this.
Well, I think that there's a real blurring of the lines in the use of the word violence. Is property destruction violence? To some people, it certainly is. But, this idea that breaking windows or other acts of property destruction are the same as actual violence against humans it's kind of a dangerous and slippery concept. And I mean, look, I don't think this is a smart move. I don't think it's a productive move from the standpoint of the protesters. But as even the chief himself said, this is a small group. This is also within this Defend the Forest movement. There are no leaders, so people go off and do their own things. That doesn't just make them justifiable, but I do think that you keep using these words violent, and it gives the impression. I mean, the only violence or the only acts of violence against people that I saw were actually police tackling protesters.
Got that? The police were the violent ones because the violence of the protesters was just against property, and it's not really the same. The left believes words are violence, silence is violence, but burning police cars and ransacking businesses, no, that's not violence. That's just property destruction. They have insurance for that. When you get beat up and put in the hospital, you got health care insurance, so I guess that's not really violence either, assuming you have health care insurance. The willingness, by the way, this was called a night of rage. This was their night of rage. And for CNN to have on a journalist to say, well, yes, I know some people call it violence and you're calling it violence, but really the only violence was the police tackling protesters. I do have to say it was rather amusing seeing a bunch of black police officers zip tie a bunch of Yankee white kids with Antifa. I mean, we're used to Yankees trying to storm Atlanta and burn it down. The difference between now and then is that now it's black police officers protecting their homes and businesses from the Yankee Antifa white kids. But this lack of willingness to call this violence by this guy, this supposed journalist, that it's not really violence, it's property destruction. That's not violence. This is an echo we hear from a lot of left-wing protesters these days, left-wing rioters and left-wing terrorists, that property destruction is different from physical violence because it's not real violence, because there's no victim, except there are victims. You just don't see them. The selfishness of these protesters and the media entertaining this. There was a shooting over the weekend in Los Angeles. It was a Lunar New Year Asian festival at a nightclub. A shooter shot 10 people, and NPR, without missing a beat, rushed out immediately to declare it the community worried because of anti-Asian hate. Anti-Asian hate. Turns out it was a 72-year-old Asian man who did the shooting. I am only surprised we have not engaged in a discussion over whether he's a white Asian or a black Asian, as the media did with George Zimmerman against Trayvon Martin. But he was Asian, and yet the media couldn't help stoking white supremacy concerns until it turned out it wasn't true. It reminds me of the spa shooting in Atlanta a couple of years ago, where a young man gunned down several women inside Asian massage parlors in Atlanta. And everyone immediately rushed to it being anti-Asian hate. The left gravitated towards it. They blamed Donald Trump. They have totally ignored the fact the guy was a sex addict, and he killed those people because he believed they were feeding his sex addiction, because those were the places he went for sex. And no one wants to have a conversation about these Asian massage parlors being fronts for prostitution. In fact, many in the media view it as female empowerment anyway for these women to be engaged in prostitution. The thing that really gets me, though, is that even on Fox News, these 20 Republicans who held up Kevin McCarthy's speakership were referred to as insurrectionists. On other television networks, they were referred to as hostage-taking terrorists. And all they did was drag out the speaker's vote. But you've got actual terrorists in Atlanta firebombing youth facilities, firebombing businesses, storming into churches to disrupt church services, vandalizing churches and private homes, and shooting police officers. And they're activists and protesters. It's a real damning indictment against the American press corps that 20 Republicans dragging out a speaker's vote in Washington could be referred to as insurrectionists and terrorists, and the actual terrorists who shot police in Atlanta, Georgia, are referred to as activists and protesters. The members of Congress are referred to as hostage takers willing to shoot the hostages, and the terrorists in Atlanta who are firebombing at-risk youth facilities, storming into churches to disrupt church services, and actually firebombing businesses are referred to as activists protesting. Look at all of the police officers who died after January 6th. Who were not directly killed by protesters storming into the U.S. Capitol. Notice they're called insurrectionists and terrorists, while these people in Atlanta are called activists and protesters. Isn't it funny, the word choice used? And those police who were not killed at the hands of the protesters or insurrectionists or terrorists or whatever you would like to be calling them in January 6th, they weren't directly killed by them, and yet these people were blamed for that. Here in Atlanta, Georgia, a police officer was literally actually shot by one of these Antifa people, and he's still called a protester. And the media has downplayed the fact that this kid shot a police officer so much, you've got people on Twitter who think it was a peaceful protester shot by police for no reason. Let me read to you how the Atlanta Journal-Constitution covered this riot. The event was held to remember 26-year-old activist Manuel Terran, who was fatally shot by a state trooper at the project site this past week. Investigators have said Terran fired first, wounding a trooper. Other troopers then returned fire, according to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The trooper, whose name was not released out of fear of retaliation, was shot in the abdomen and underwent emergency surgery, according to investigators. In addition to seeking the end of the project, the protesters Saturday were calling for an independent probe into Taryn's death. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation has said there's no body cam footage of the incident. Protesters also want the city to defund the Atlanta Police Department. APD, you got that? They want to defund it. Incidentally, as an aside, it's a throwaway line the AJC has used in several of these stories. At the very end, the protesters also want to defund the police. Let me tell you how they should have worded that first paragraph if they actually wanted to be objective and not downplay what happened. The event was held to remember 26-year-old Manuel Taryn, who police say shot a police officer in the stomach, provoking the return fire that killed the protester. That's what actually happened. And yet they tiptoe around that because the Antifa kids just deny reality and deny truth. And the media says, if these people on the left are denying reality, we should too. People on the right say the election was stolen, which isn't true. And the media attacks them relentlessly every day. We can't allow these people in power. Antifa says he was peaceful and unarmed, and it's not true. And then he's like, maybe he was peaceful and unarmed. We should believe Antifa, not people on the right. Last night, the Associated Press tweeted this. One of Sarah Huckabee Sanders' first acts as Arkansas governor was to ban most state agencies from using the gender-neutral term Latinx, tapping into a debate that divides Hispanics along generational lines. That was the tweet. When you read the story from the AP underlying that tweet, here's what you find, quote, Sanders' order adds to the debate over a word that's found little support among Latinos and even prompted backlash from some Democrats. The Associated Press's own data shows that 0% of Hispanic Americans use the word Latinx. Only 3% of Americans overall do, and somehow they felt compelled to put out a tweet that this action by Governor Huckabee tapped into a debate that's divided Hispanics. No one's divided. They found one nut job. A non-binary person named Angel Castillo-Reyes, a 21-year-old non-binary student at the University of Arkansas who uses the pronouns they, them. The Associated Press allowed one person with mental health issues to trump millions of Hispanic Americans who reject the word because people at the Associated Press who are white use the word Latinx. And then you've got the both sidesism of the Joe Biden classified documents that Trump is actually really worse. Forget Joe Biden's positions. We can't be a free press, we can't be a free people. When the press nuance the shooting of a police officer in Atlanta and then try to muddy the water in Los Angeles with the shooting in an Asian community by an Asian person. A free people need a free press. But our press corps is cloistered in a progressive bubble captured by their loathing of people who aren't like them. Look at how they treated the hockey player Provy or Tony Dungy, who participated in the pro-life march, speaking of which none of these members of the press bothered to even cover the largest protest march in Washington every year. They only cover what the left cares about from the sympathies of the left, which makes my job more valuable and necessary, but also I'm kind of tired of having to sift through the BS of a press corps that demands freedom of the press while taking away and being complicit in the taking away of all the rest of our freedoms.